bit about my friend Bob Barr. Bob Barr and I met each other back in the early 1980s, and he was the Southeast Region District Attorney, Federal District Attorney. He took on the Medellin cartel, and his life was threatened many times. As a matter of fact, I can remember going to their house on Walker's Ridge out there in West Cobb, and we were met by security sweeping our car to make sure that we weren't bringing something in to hurt Bob Barr at his birthday party. That was a reality check for me. But the best part about Bob Barr is who he truly is. Bob, of course, is married to his wife, Jerry. They have 5 kids, of which he has 2 wonderful boys that are now both attorneys, I think. But Bob Barr ran for the Senate against Senator Paul Coverdale. There were 7 in the race. We traveled all over the state. I was his volunteer director, and my husband was director of his campaign. My sweet, dear, departed husband, Colonel Al Rowe. So he ran the campaign for Bob Barr. And we did. We traveled the whole state. We ended up in a runoff. And the day before the election, this was before those things called no excuse absentee ballot, the days before you could just drop your ballot off, the days before you didn't need an ID, and all those things happened. But in Waycross, Georgia, there was a movement not to elect Bob Barr because he was a conservative. And we lost to Paul Coverdale. The next day, Bob went over to the Crown Plaza Ravinia, met with Senator Coverdale, told him he would support him against the Democrat, and Bob Barr was a gentleman, and he did just that. The next year, he came back to his campaign staff and said, I'm going to run for Congress. Now, the person we took on was a heavily entrenched part of the old school Democratic Party, not the Democratic Party of today. But he was entrenched, and we had to take him out. He had almost $12 million, and I can tell you for a fact Bob Barr had $85,000. And we won that race by 68%, and he went to Congress and defended us. The reason I'm telling you this story is because that's what you all need to do. I think it's great we're sitting around talking. I think that's wonderful. But we didn't get Bob Barr elected by just talk. We had to get out there and we had to get them elected. So if you don't like someone that's running, throw your hat in the ring, get some people behind you. Like I know this gal here, she's Miss Sign Installer of the World. But yeah, we worked on Joe Prophet together. But I'm just here to tell you, you have to make a difference, and you have to make a difference outside this room. So when Bob gets here, I'm glad I had the chance to tell you that story. But he went off to Congress, and he stood up for us when no one else would. He impeached Clinton. He was one of the impeachment managers, and he stood with us the whole way. So you're going to have a hero walk in this room when he gets here. I hope he's not lost again. But anyways, I hope that helps you a little bit to understand the hero that's going to walk in this room.
Donna, tell us about how in the state we didn't have any representation and how we won gradually. So all things are not so bad now. But, I mean,
well, let me tell you, you can tell by my accent that I'm Georgian by choice, but Yankee by birth. And I was born and raised in Massachusetts. So you want to talk about a democratic state. At the age of 13, I made up my mind that we needed an attorney general that would indict our very corrupt governor. And I worked with teen Republicans, and we got Ed Brooke, a black Republican, elected. So there is a way to do this. When we moved to Georgia, it was all one party. And everything they wanted and everything they did, everything they wanted to do, we just had to acquiesce. I decided that I was going to get active. I decided that I was going to make a difference. It could only be a little me. I'm 5'4", but I went out and I did it. And we went from a phone booth to, well, the other day I was in a room with almost 600 people who were afraid to death for this country. Now you gotta go back out and do it again. You gotta do it again. You sat back complacently. You expected your neighbor to vote. You didn't tell your kids to vote. You didn't get out there and go door to door. So you have to, if you care, if you truly care, and I care, I went to war for this country. I saw the sacrifice for freedom, literally on my hands. I saw that blood. I saw what happens. And they went to give you that freedom. And so if you can't get 10 more people to vote, then there's really something wrong with us. There's really something wrong with us. So I think you can do it. You can do it. We all can do it together. And I firmly believe in people like Bob Barr. Believe me. And people like Michael and Pam and our sweet to-be next chairman, Sally Grubbs. But I believe in us. I believe we can do it again. We let it go. We let it go.
Thank you, Donna. And Donna is a real hero for what she did in Vietnam. And she's been recognized for it. It's not a fabrication of our imagination. He is for real. Bob, thank you very much for coming. I've got to get the manager because I promised him to be Bob, you missed the introduction by Donna Rowe and several others of us, so you're ready to go off.
I appreciate it. The first mistake was relying on GPS. The second one was relying on the old address that was sent to me. So I do apologize. I mean, this is terrible to be so late. But I appreciate those of you that had enough patience to wait on me. Because when Michael and I talked several weeks ago about what might be a good topic, of course, we're all concerned about our Bill of Rights, all portions of it, including, of course, the Second Amendment, which I'm going to do battle on as soon as I leave here. I have to catch a flight to Dallas, Texas, for an NRA board meeting. And I'll be very interested in getting a report as a board member for the NRA on the goings on there, and I'll be glad to report back to Michael on that. But one of the things in thinking about the Second Amendment that I think is important for all of us to keep in mind that a lot of our friends don't, and that is when you look at the Bill of Rights, whether it's the Second Amendment right to keep and bear arms, the First Amendment, which includes, as we know, several parts, in terms of religion and assembly and petition and speech, the Fourth Amendment, which includes, of course, the right to be free from warrantless searches and unreasonable searches and seizures. I think it's important that we remember and remind our friends that you can't pick those out, pick and choose them out. They're all part of a fabric, constitutional fabric. And what our enemies do a lot of times is that they'll try and pick and choose those so that they'll attack one and sort of whittle away at it, hoping we won't pay attention to what they're doing elsewhere. And there was, for example, 15 minutes. Okay. There was a case that you all might have seen earlier this week, an argument before the Supreme Court that joined two very, very important rights that are guaranteed us in the Bill of Rights. We don't get rights in the Bill of Rights. They're guaranteed us in the Bill of Rights. They're pre-existing. They pre-exist government. They come from God, and we as human beings enjoy those. But the Supreme Court heard an argument on Wednesday that joined the Fourth Amendment, which protects us against warrantless searches and seizures, and the right to keep and bear arms in the Second Amendment. And if you look at that case, it was out of Rhode Island, and government overreach in Rhode Island doesn't surprise us that much. But what happened in that case is a lady called the police and said, "I'm worried about my husband. He had a firearm, and I'm afraid he might do something to himself or somebody else." She left the house. because she was afraid. They had had an argument, she and her husband, probably in their 60s, I think, at the time. This case was presented back in 2015. And while she was away, she called the police and told the police she's worried about her husband. Now, this brings up a very, very important issue. What is the role of police in our society? What is the role of law enforcement? Historically, as we inherited from old British common law and was enshrined in the founding documents of ours and reaffirmed in Supreme Court cases, even in recent years, it is not the primary job of the police to protect us. It is an individual responsibility that we as citizens have. We assume responsibility, always have, and historically and traditionally have, to protect ourselves. Yet, what has happened in recent decades, and we saw it in this case out of Rhode Island just this week, what has happened is the police have taken on, and we have allowed them to take on, and through our local governments have paid them to take on all manner of responsibilities over and above simply that of traditional policing. And there's an exception that many people haven't even heard of. I mean, I really hadn't heard of it for many years. There's an exception to the warrant requirement that the Fourth Amendment holds. And that is that if the police are performing, get this, a community caretaker function, then they can ignore the warrant requirement. Now, when that case was, that doctrine was first developed 40 or 45 years ago, it had to do with automobiles. When the police stopped an automobile, in order to protect the public, so it's sort of amorphous principle, they were allowed to search the vehicle. Well, what the government of Rhode Island and the U.S. Department of Justice now, under new leadership, what they want to do is they want to extend that very, very narrow exception to the home place. So that in this case, the police were called simply because the wife was worried about her husband, so she calls the police, doesn't call a neighbor, doesn't call a relative, calls the police. They come to the house and they say to the husband, you need to go get a mental examination. And they promised him that if he did that, they wouldn't take his firearms. Now, his firearms were lawfully owned, had 2 handguns, and there was no evidence of any crime having been committed. While the husband was away, as the police ordered him to do to get a mental examination, they went into the house, searched the house, took his firearms and all the ammunition, and wouldn't return them to him. Now, this does not fall under one of the other exceptions where there are exigent circumstances. There was no emergency. He was not mentally ill. There was no crime that had been committed or was likely to be committed. And the police had plenty of time to go get a warrant from the judge if they had wanted to. But what they're now arguing, and the U.S. Department of Justice, very disturbingly, has joined the argument of Rhode Island to hold that if in fact the police are performing this vague caretaker function, which they should never have the responsibility for in the first place, they can go into a person's house without a warrant and seize their firearms. So what I've read about the oral argument before the Supreme Court on Wednesday worries me. John Roberts and these sort of things, it's a surprise if he ever votes for the Bill of Rights. So don't have to, that was no surprise. What worries me is Justice Kavanaugh. Justice Kavanaugh, I think, has been intimidated by the horrible experience that he had to go through in 2018 when he was confirmed. And he and a couple of the other justices were asking questions that seemed to be in the direction of, well, you don't want to hold up the police. I mean, what if there really had been an emergency? What if the husband really had been mentally disturbed? What if he really had to? Well, there are all sorts of what ifs. But that doesn't remove the constitutional guarantee that a man's or woman's home place is secured against unreasonable and warrantless searches and seizures, and particularly where firearms are concerned. So the court won't decide this case for a few months. Their term goes to the summer. They'll probably hold it off until the end of the term, early in the summer, because that's what they do with controversial cases. who knows where they're going to rule. They could simply uphold the lower federal courts, which said the police can do whatever they want, basically. Or they could say the police can't do this, or they could say, well, they can do it in certain circumstances. We don't know, but it's a very, very important case because it brings together the question of what is the role of the police in today's society and how far can they go in ignoring or trampling on constitutionally guaranteed rights that we have. And this whole issue of gun control is pitting police against law-abiding Second Amendment citizens in ways that are very, very dangerous. And we see it even in Cobb County. We now have sort of a new generation sheriff in Cobb County and a new generation DA, as we're seeing in other cities around the country, that don't hold the traditional view of particularly an elected law enforcement official, who generally speaking are far more observant of individual liberties than our police, which are appointed by, the police chiefs are appointed by local government, sheriffs are elected by we the people. So up until very recently, sheriffs could be more reliable in terms of protecting individual liberties, including the right to keep and bear arms, than a lot of the police chiefs were, who are beholden to the local politicos. But in Cobb County, we now have a DA who is more interested in restorative justice than in enforcing the law. And we have a DA that is more interested in restorative justice than prosecuting crimes. And we're seeing that now in a lot of parts of the country. And when you have a Department of Justice now that says it's okay for police to go into a house under a vague caretaker, community caretaker notion, look for guns and take guns without a warrant, without any reasonable belief that there's a crime that's been committed or there are exigent circumstances, we have some real problems coming up here. Now, we shouldn't have to rely on the Supreme Court to take care of these problems, but where you have so many local officials now, a lot of them backed by George Soros, and you have now an administration that believes that the Bill of Rights really means nothing, unless you're an illegal alien, I suppose, then it has all sorts of meanings. So it's very, very important that we take a very hard look at what our local police are doing, what they're funded to do, what they're allowed to do, and we ought not to just sit back and say, oh, it's okay, let the police do this, let the police do the other thing, they're all there to protect us, they're to secure the community. No, their role is very narrow, and when it impacts constitutional rights, constitutional liberties and rights take precedence over what the police might want to do if there's no crime being committed in their presence, or if they have reasonable suspicion that a crime is being committed, or they've gone and gotten a warrant. Michael, I'm going to leave with you a paper that I just did about a month or so ago, published by the Heritage Foundation, that deals with a lot of the history of the Second Amendment and conservatives and some of the tensions now that are really building between conservatives and local police over the Second Amendment, that I think we really need to pay close, as we all do here, but a lot of our friends and associates don't pay close enough attention to these principles. So, you tell me if we have time for a question or two.
We have 7 minutes. Okay. We have 7 minutes. We have a commitment to be through. We've been given this 15-minute extension, so it's 7 minutes after, and we'll be out of here and close at 1:15. Questions for Bob?
Yes, you can ask me. I had my hand up first.
I know you have your hand up. Okay? Just a minute. I'm looking to see if anyone else has their hand up who hasn't spoken yet. Go ahead.
All right, Mr. Barr, I read that case because it's on Wednesday, and so my concern is, so they have it one way, and then they want to have it another way. So the Brianna Twatty, whatever her name is,
Brianna Taylor.
No knock warrant, and then she got murdered, and the whole Black Lives Matter after that. So how can they justify that and then want to stand on this side? I mean, they want to flip-flop all over the place. I mean, not for the police, now they're for the police.
Yeah.
Right?
Much like the filibuster, they were for the filibuster, now they're against the filibuster. If one is like, you remember the old Greek tale of Diogenes with his lamp searching for an honest man, searching forever. If that lamp is now in the hands of we the citizens and we're searching for consistency, we're not going to find it. It's a very, very good question. There's no substantive answer as to why they can do this. Argue one way for this group of people, different way for another. They are allowed, they get away with doing it because we let them get away with it. Biden was elected president, at least according to the powers that be. We now have a Department of Justice that believes that the Fourth Amendment and the Second Amendment are subject to some vague standard of community protection, which means that the Fourth Amendment prohibition against warrantless searches and seizures doesn't really mean anything, and it means the Second Amendment can be swept away simply because the police believe, oh, there's a community concern here, so we have to take somebody's firearms away from their house without a warrant. Your question, the only answer to it is we, the people, need to assert our constitutional understanding and make sure that local officials, local police, local sheriffs, local DAs support their oath of office, and that is uphold the law, not simply decide, well, I think these laws are too strict, so I'm just not going to enforce them. Or I believe these laws are racially motivated or based on a systemically racist society, so I'm not going to enforce them. No, that's not the right standard. That's a violation of their oath of office, and we need to, stand up and say so.
My heart is beating fast. You cannot imagine how upset I feel listening to you. We the people voted for a president. Fraud overturned that vote. We the people believe in the Constitution and the Bill of Rights. And now you're describing a situation where they don't give a damn, those who are in power. What can we the people do if this continues? If those in power are willing to violate the Constitution, if the courts are unwilling to listen to the evidence, including the Supreme Court, what do you think ultimately we the people will have left? If our vote doesn't count, you may know what I'm trying to think of, what I'm thinking about. Thank goodness we have a Second Amendment. We better hold on to that Second Amendment and our weapons. But what ultimately will we the people have to turn this around if those in power continue to violate all the principles upon which this country has operated in the future?
My silence answers that. But what we have, because we, each one of us, and we collectively to rely on. And ultimately, it's our responsibility. There was another important case that was decided not by the Supreme Court, but by one of the circuit courts of appeal just earlier this week. It has to do with bump stocks. I don't know whether you remember that the Trump administration, unfortunately, decided that the Department of Justice should define a bump stock as a machine gun. As a machine gun. And the Justice Department, ATF, did this about a year and a half ago under the Trump administration and said, we don't even have to go to Congress. We can just do this by regulatory redefinition. The First Circuit Court of Appeals said, no, you can't do that. Now, that's not the end of the matter, because with this administration, they'll just go to the Congress and get Congress to outlaw bump stocks. But it's an important decision, so every now and then there's a little gleam of light in these decisions. That First Circuit decision from earlier this week is a very important one. It slapped the government on the wrist for doing by regulatory redefinition what they need to do by law.
Bob, thank you very much, and we are out of time. We committed to be out of here by 1:15, but this is not the last time Bob will be here. He will hear again just as soon as his schedule permits and his
Now
willingness
that I
to
know
do
where
so.
it is.
Now that you know where it is. So Bob, thank you very much for coming. We really appreciate it. And thank you, Madison.